Hello class, I'm going to talk to you about expressionistic painting, and we're going to discuss some of the artists that have worked in the past as well as some of the artists that work today in this style. Okay, but before we get to that, I really want you to just compare these two paintings, which have the same subject matter, a rural pastoral scene, but are painted in two completely different ways. And I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. What ways do these differ in the way that they're painted? Okay, in the past, students have suggested that they differ with regard to the use of color. Okay, the one on the left uses color as it would appear to the eye. Okay, the color is observed. The one to the right doesn't. Okay, I've never seen a blue cow, nor have I seen a pink trail. I have seen green grass, so that is the color as you would see it to the eye. But the other aspects, there's a lot more artistic license taken. Next, you might have noticed that their use of brushstrokes is different. The one on the left has more consistent dab-like strokes. The one on the right has often more varied and longer brushstrokes. Another aspect you may have noticed is proportions. So the one on the left has proportions that look realistic, okay, and accurate. The one on the right, that's not always the case. Okay, we have, a cow whose back is very long and elongated. Okay, and also they've been made to look more jagged. So expressionistic painters are most interested in depicting the world as it feels, as opposed to how it looks. So in the last two styles of painting, impressionistic painting and photorealistic painting, we were most interested in painting something as it looked. But now we're going to kind of switch gears and we're going to be painting something as it feels. Okay, and these artists were most interested in depicting their emotions and subjective responses to their subject matter or to events, and describing these through paint. Now, they had many tools at their disposal, but the three that we're going to focus on are expressive brushstrokes, arbitrary color, and distortion of form. So expressive brushstrokes, first, are brushstrokes that are painterly. Okay, they're visible. They're not blended out. And you can, these are pretty subtle, but you can still see them. There's brushstrokes here that are visible. Okay? And oftentimes these brushstrokes are more varied. They could be long, they could be short, and there's usually more variety of them. Whereas with impressionistic painting, they tend to be a little bit more consistent brushstrokes. They also use arbitrary color, which is when the painter chooses not to paint the color that they see or would see, but they choose a color for aesthetic or emotionally expressive purposes. So for example, painting the cow blue, okay, or the trail purple. Okay, now, I think arbitrary, it's kind of a misleading word because it implies that these choices are random. That's not the case, okay? When the painters are choosing these colors, they're very intentional with them. Random is as if the painter closed their eyes and picked a paint tube from their case, okay? But that's not the way that these artists were working, okay? These artists chose these colors very intentionally. And another tool they had was distortion of form. Okay, so rather than paint the proportions that they've seen, they twisted and elongated and changed the proportions for expressive purposes. Okay, so the first movement we're going to talk about is Expressionism. And this occurred from roughly 1905 to 1930. And just to make this clear, when I say expressionistic painting, I'm talking about the style. It's a way of working. When I say expressionism, I'm talking about a specific group of artists that worked in a specific place. In the same way, when I say neo-expressionism, I'm talking about a specific group of artists that worked in a specific place. Okay, so these are movements, And when I say expressionistic painting, I'm just talking about a way of working. Okay, so Expressionism is an art movement uh, which flourished in Europe from 1905 to 1930. And many of these artists were centered around Germany and Austria. Okay, now this isn't a painting per se, but it does have painted elements. It has graphite, pen, and colored ink. Okay, and look at these beautiful strokes that are made. Okay, and the use of color. It's like, oh, this looks so washed out, almost dead. And then it's up here, it's so lively. Okay, and kind of hopeful. Okay, and one artist that's part of the Expressionism movement is Ernst Kirchner. Okay, and he was a painter um, that was part of the German Expressionistic group, which translates to the bridge in English. So here's one of his works called Two Girls, and you can see, some of these expressionistic tendencies we were talking about, such as the use of arbitrary color. The painter, painted her green, okay, and it creates a certain emotional feeling to the scene. Okay, it makes her possibly look sick or possibly envious, although that could be, maybe that's color symbolism. But in some way, discontent or conflicted or agitated. At least that's my own interpretation. The artist also, changed the proportions a bit. Okay, sharpen the corners of the elbows. Okay, and also, the artist also used expressive brushstrokes. A lot of these strokes are visible, and they're very lively. So there's two more works by Kirchner. There's one on the left called Street Berlin, and you'll notice the elongated forms. You'll notice these very jagged shapes. Okay, the forms are changed and distorted to make them more jagged. Okay, the color is kind of within this analogous color harmony. Okay, and we got this work on the right, and this is a street scene, and it looks like the perspective has been kind of distorted a bit. Maybe you consider, what type of feeling does that create, and what was done with the street, which looks like it was, looks like it's kind of twisted. What kind of feeling does that create? Does it create a sense of ease and stability? Or do you think it creates something that feels more unstable and chaotic? There's another artist called Marianne Rurfkin, and I might be mispronouncing that. She was a Russian, Swiss, German painter that was part of the Blue Rider group. This is another expressionism group in Europe. Here are two of her works. Okay, and look at this beautiful expressive use of color. Okay, the yellow in the face, the purple in the face. Although the expression on her face suggests, more somber mood, the colors suggest, some playful inner life. And this one's interesting as well. I really love the negative space that's created here. These marks are really interesting. Looks like the paint was tore up right here. Here's another work by her. Okay, this one kind of reminds me of Van Gogh. Van Gogh's like Night Cafe. Okay, now we're going to talk about Neo-Expressionism. And this is a movement which occurred from the 1970s to 1990s. And it was one of its work by one of its artists, Basquiat. And basically, anytime you see neo, it means new or revived form of something. So you're about neo pop art. That means it's a revived form of pop art. And when you hear neo expressionism, it means a revived form of expressionism. So these artists took aspects of the original expressionism movement, okay, such as those artists that we've seen previously, but they brought it into a new context. Okay, they brought it into um, this context of the 1970s to 1990s. This doesn't mean that they were regurgitating what happened before, but they were taking, uh, this sensibility of painting the world as it felt and applying it to the world they lived in, and using it to describe the world they lived in. And one of these artists is Basquiat, and this was an American painter who was working in New York and began as a graffiti artist and later moved to making work in galleries and showing in galleries. And became an international art star. And you've probably seen him on t-shirts, on stickers. He's definitely a figure in pop culture. Okay, here's one of his works. Maybe consider for a moment how this is different than the work of the Expressionism movement. Maybe something about the composition. Here's another work by Basquiat. He'd like to involve a lot of writing in his work, lots of words, and also collaged elements. So things that he pasted onto the support. And supports were often varied. They weren't always canvases. He often painted on wood or found objects. Even painted on a helmet. Here's another one of his works. Okay, you see these really awesome expressive brushstrokes. I really like this red in the hair. It's really interesting. Oh, this looks quite violent, but also very playful. So here's another artist, Francisco Clemente. And this is another neo-expressionist who worked in Italy and often painted the human figure, and whose work discussed themes of spirituality and sexuality. Here's one of his works, Scissors and Butterflies. Here's another one of his works. And this one's pretty interesting. It almost looks like a figure with different personalities. At least that's how I interpret it. I really like the application of paint here, which looks like it's kind of staining the surface of the support. So now we're going to talk about some contemporary artists, artists that work today, that work in this expressionistic style. So one of these artists is Jenny Saville, and she's really interested in painting unidealized images of the female human body, and she works in the UK. Here's one of her paintings. You can see this expressive brushstrokes. These are often huge and monumental, so scale is important in her work. Okay, here's another one of her work called The Mothers. I think that's really beautiful here are these these expressive brushstrokes. Like they create so much movement, and really describes the work of mothers. Here's another work of hers. The expressive use of color, expressive strokes. Okay, another artist that works today in expressionistic style is Cicely Brown. She's also a British painter, and she's known for making large canvases of the human figure, and are often erotic poses. So here's one of her works, called Trouble in Paradise. Okay, and if you look close, you can start to see the figures start to come through. Here's another one of her works. Where, when, how often, with whom. Remember, a student said this looks like a music festival. Like it reminded them of Coachella. It kind of does look like that. It looks like people sitting on some type of surface. It also looks quite warm wherever they're at. Well, at least that's what I see. This one's untitled. Okay, another artist is Nicole Eisenman. She's a contemporary American painter known for her figurative paintings, and she has many paintings that are expressionistic, or that have an expressionistic sensibility. Here's one of her works, and this one's very interesting, I think, because of its kind of childlike, playful aesthetic. The flowers, these little clouds, these outlines. It feels childlike, but in a very intentional way. Okay, lots of kissing people. What's beautiful about this is this paint in the background, which looks so watercolor-like, and how it's kind of juxtaposed against this more opaque paint. It creates a lot of depth in the surface. Here's another one of her works. More kissing people. This one's a little sinister, so she's gonna cut his neck. She's defecating on his ear. Another one of her paintings, and I just want to bring your attention to some of the paint application. It's really interesting, like right here, where the background's coming through, so you can see some of the yellow coming through here. Like it's scratched up. That's really interesting. And then also like this kind of the fleshiness of this, the bottom of this sculpture. Also, the negative space here is very interesting. And the tension that's created by how close they are, but they're not touching.